Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're venturing into the darkest corners of America's wilderness, places where the trail ends, the road bends, and the night swallows every sound. I'll be sharing a collection of true encounters and chilling legends from remote mountains, shadowed forests, and lonely backroads across the country. These aren't campfire myths. These are real experiences that linger long after the sun goes down. So grab a blanket, kill the lights, and settle in for a journey where beauty meets terror. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and share your own eerie stories in the comments. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The Woman in the Apple Orchard. I only ever cut through the McCready place because the weather turned, and I didn't feel like adding a mile of road walk to a day already heavy with rain. It was one of those Appalachian afternoons that sits on your shoulders like a wet coat. A low sky, no wind, just the steady hush of drizzle sinking into the fields and making the fence posts bleed dark into the grass. The orchard spread down from the old farmhouse like a story the land hadn't finished telling. Rows of bowed trees, limbs heavy with apples no one wanted, red and gold collapsing into brown where they fell. The ground had turned sponge soft with rot. Each step gave a slow, sucking sound, and the smell, sweet at first then sour, stuck to the back of my throat until I tasted it when I swallowed. My boots left cratered crescents behind me. I kept my hood up and eyes down and told myself it was just a quicker way through. The same way you tell yourself a closed door in an abandoned hallway is just a door, not a choice you'll think about later. You can tell a place that's been left alone for too long by how it listens. The McCready orchard had a listening kind of quiet, the sort that takes your breath and sets it on a table somewhere, waits to see what you'll do next. The drizzle softened every edge. Apples thumped the ground without urgency, the sound swallowed in the mulch of 100 other apples that had fallen before them. When the wind did move, it didn't rustle, just shifted the smell a degree closer to ferment, like something brewing too close to heat. I remember thinking about a story my grandfather told me when I was young, about folks who went to ground during hard years and never came all the way back out of it. He said the mountains were kinder than most people realized, but they never forgot what they gave you, and they'd ask for it back, piece by piece, if you weren't careful. I saw her between two trees that had grown together at the base like an old couple holding hands. She was crouched, back rounded, knees out, the way kids sit when they're playing in the dirt. Her hair was matted into long ropes the color of wet bark. A grey dress clung to her in seams and shreds, dark where the rain had fixed it to her skin. The thing that made me stop wasn't how she looked, it was how she was holding the apple. Both hands cupped around it like it was a bird she was trying to warm. She kept turning it slow, studying it like the red might rub off on her palms. I called out because it was the reflex you have when you think you found someone in trouble. My voice didn't carry far. The orchard took it, the way it took the thump of the falling fruit and made it part of its own weather. She didn't react, didn't lift her head, didn't startle. She bit the apple, and the sound was the smallest little snap, wet and clean, that I could still hear across the 30 feet between us. The bite was too careful. She didn't tear at it. She pressed her teeth in and rocked them like she wasn't sure what the apple expected from her. I said I could help. I said I had water and a phone. I said there were people in town. I remember each sentence sounding wrong in my mouth, like I had picked words meant for another room. The woman chewed and swallowed like someone learning a new movement. That was when the wind shifted and I caught another smell under the sweet rot, old iron and mud, and something like wood smoke that had soaked into cloth and skin, the way a house carries last winter even when you've got the windows open in June. I took one step back. The ground made that soft, tearing noise as my boot lifted out of it. The woman stilled. I said I was going to go get help. I said it without thinking, because it was the right thing to say, even though every cell in my body nudged me toward the fence line. She moved then, not up, forward. She put her hands down and came toward me on all fours, the apple clamped between her teeth now, the wet ends of her hair dragging ruts in the mulch. That's when I saw what scraped the ground behind her. Not an object, not a rope. The hem of that dress had been knotted and knotted again around her ankles, then around the meat of her calves, as if someone had tied fabric to itself to keep legs from opening all the way, to shorten a stride. The cloth had swollen with rain. The knots were dark and hard and slick, and when she crawled, her knees pulled the whole mess along, a dead weight of soaked binding. My voice left me, not in a dramatic way, just in the way a flashlight goes dim when you need it. I backed away, and she kept coming, eyes up now. Her eyes were not wild. Wild would have been easier. They were fixed and practical, the way you look at something you've already decided to do. The apple fell from her mouth. It landed near her hand and rolled into a hollow where other apples had gone soft. She put her palm flat in the mud, and what I thought were her nails turned out to be small, chipped bits of metal, can tabs, maybe bottle caps, wired on with loops, as if she'd needed claws and made do. When she clenched, the metal bit into the wet ground and held. She came faster. I turned and ran. There's no grace to running in an orchard that's gone over to rot. It's falling forward and trusting there's ground when your foot comes down. I slid on burst skins and felt the sweet paste of apples push up the sides of my boots. Branches snagged the back of my jacket and tried to pull me in close. I aimed for the break in the fence I'd used to enter, a low collapse where someone else had stepped over 100 times, and I told myself I wouldn't look back, because nothing good sits behind a choice like that. Of course, I looked. She was coming in the same steady crawl, head level, mouth open now and breathing hard, and I could see in that mouth the small, careful bites she'd taken out of too many things. Apples maybe, and maybe not only apples. The metal bits on her fingers flashed dull. The knots on her legs were bleeding color into the rain. The fence gave under my weight. I landed on my hands in the ditch and slid a few feet on moss and leaves. When I scrambled up the other side and turned, she had stopped at the fence line, as if the orchard itself were a boundary she respected or couldn't cross. She rose to her knees, then to a crouch. In that odd half-stand, she didn't look feral. She looked like someone on the threshold of a house she had not been invited into for a very long time. Her mouth worked around a shape that wasn't a word, then another. I thought I heard the start of my name, which made no sense. Then the drizzle thickened, and she leaned back on her hands and dropped again to all fours and began to drag herself along the inside of the fence toward the old farmhouse, favoring that same slow, inexorable path you take in a dream when you can't will your body to do anything but continue. I didn't go to town first. I went home, because the kind of fear that gets into your fingers and won't come out until you're holding something familiar will steer you toward your own table and your own sink and the cup you use every day. I locked the door, which is the most useless gesture we have, and stood with my forehead against the cool glass of the window above the kitchen sink and watched the rain make a river of the yard. I told myself I had imagined the metal and the knots and the apple between her teeth. I told myself I was tired and the orchard had worked on me the way old places do when they decide you're a good box to put their stories in. Half an hour later, when my hands had stopped shaking enough that a phone wouldn't have slid out of them, I called the sheriff. I said there might be a woman in trouble at the McCready place. I left out the parts that would have made him write my name in a smaller hand. He said he'd send a deputy to take a look. He asked me to stay by the phone. I said I would. It grew dark with that quickness rain has in the mountains, and the house warmed up around me. the heat kicking on in little gusts, and the smell of dust burning off the baseboards. The deputy called an hour later to say he'd gone up the farm road from the other side. He said the orchard looked like it always does. He said he didn't see anyone. He said there was a place near the fence where the ground looked churned, maybe deer, but he didn't find prints he liked. He told me he'd swing by again in the morning. The way he said morning made evening feel longer. That night, I dreamed of apples, how they go from perfect to gone in a breath, how sweetness turns and doesn't ask your permission. I woke to a sound like a small thing tapping. It took me a minute to realize it wasn't in the house. I stepped to the window, and for a moment, because the brain is always trying to make sense from the smallest pieces, I thought I saw a pale shape at the edge of my yard, crouched where the old wire fence sags behind the shed. There was no orchard here, just a boundary and the dark pressed against it. The tapping stopped. The rain had eased to a mist that held the world close. I stood with my hand on the light switch and didn't flip it. I don't use the McCready shortcut anymore. I add the mile on the road and nod at the orchard from a distance like you nod to a neighbor you don't really know. Sometimes when the wind is right and the apples are falling, the smell reaches the cut where the highway bends. That sweet, sour note that says the land is busy making and unmaking. And I think about how she looked at the apple, like it might answer a question if she held it long enough. The deputy said later that old man McCready had a daughter no one saw after the bad winter of '94. Some folks said she married and moved to Morganton. Some said she didn't. What people say depends on what they need their nights to feel like. I keep my nights simple. I set my boots by the door. I check the locks I know won't save me from anything that wants in. And when I wake to the smallest, cleanest snap, I tell myself it's the house settling, it's the heat, it's anything but what I remember. And I lie still and listen to a place that knows my name answer back with a silence that isn't empty. Story 2. The cabin with no smoke. The trail up past Big Cedar Ridge always felt longer in winter, even before the snow got deep enough to hide the blazes on the trees. My uncle's voice still rang in my ears from the night before, telling me to take the supplies to Cal Rimmer's cabin before the weather boxed him in completely. Cal was one of those men who stayed out in the high country for months at a time, wintering alone, living lean. I didn't know him well, but I knew his place, an old trapper's cabin that had been patched up over the years by hunters who passed through. I'd seen it before from a distance. Rough timbers, tin roof patched with mismatched sheets of metal, and always a plume of smoke curling from the chimney when someone was there. That morning, the wind was low, the kind that lets sound travel farther than it should. My boots broke the crusted snow with a steady crunch. The forest was still in that held breath way you sometimes get before a storm, and the cold sat heavier the higher I climbed. When I reached the clearing, the cabin stood exactly where I expected, lights burning soft in the windows, a dark figure passing across one of them. But the chimney was dead. No smoke, no heat shimmer, just a dusting of snow gathered on the stone like it had been untouched for days. I told myself maybe Cal had just let the fire go out. Maybe he was tending to something else. Still, when I stepped into the clearing, I felt it. The air here was sharper, colder than on the trail. Snowflakes caught in my lashes didn't melt as quick. It made me hesitate before stepping onto the porch. I knocked, and the sound didn't echo the way wood should. It was swallowed, like the air inside was too heavy to give it back. The door creaked inward with a slow push, though I hadn't leaned on it. Inside, the cabin was warm. Not the sharp heat of a fire, but a steady, skin-deep warmth that didn't seem to come from anywhere. The hearth held only a ring of blackened stones, the ash inside cold to the touch when I reached for it. The light came from oil lamps hanging on the far wall, their flames still as if the air wasn't moving at all. In the far corner, a man stood facing the wall. His back was to me, shoulders slack, arms hanging loose at his sides. His hair was grey, matted in the back like he'd been sleeping upright. Cal? My voice felt thin against the close air. He didn't turn, didn't speak. I tried again, said I'd brought food, kerosene, blankets, nothing. The space between my words and the wall stretched too long, like the sound had to travel farther than the room allowed. I took a step closer, then stopped. Something about the way he stood wasn't right. Not in the shape of him, but in the stillness. People shift when they stand. They scratch. They breathe deep. They shift their weight. Cal didn't. His shoulders didn't rise or fall. I couldn't even hear the sound of his breath. I set the sack of supplies down on the nearest table. The wood under my hands was warm, but dry, the way it gets when it's been near heat for days. Except there was no fire, no stove going. I thought about touching his shoulder, but the idea made my fingers ache before I even moved. Instead, I backed toward the door, slow, keeping him in my sight. When I stepped back onto the porch, the air hit me like it does when you come out of a hot room into a winter night. Except I'd just left something without a fire. I turned down the steps and walked into the clearing, not running, but close to it. I told myself not to look back until I hit the tree line. When I finally did, every lamp in the cabin went out at once, the windows turning black. The trail down felt longer than the climb up. The trees pressed close, their branches heavy with snow. A few times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft, muffled in the fresh powder, but when I stopped, the forest went still again. It was the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it just waits. Back at my uncle's place, I told him Cal didn't answer the door, but I'd left the supplies. I didn't say anything about the warmth, or the lamps, or the way the lights died. My uncle nodded slow, like he'd expected as much, and didn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. A week later, after the snowstorm finally broke, I overheard him on the phone telling someone the cabin was empty when they'd gone up. No tracks, no lamps, no sign anyone had been there for weeks. They found the supplies I'd left still sitting on the porch, buried under a thin crust of snow. I never went back to Big Cedar Ridge, but sometimes, when I'm out in the woods alone, I catch that same held breath stillness, and I think about the way Cal stood in that corner, not moving, not turning, like he was waiting for something on the other side of the wall, and I wonder if, in some cold and quiet place, he still is. Story 3. The Creek That Went Silent. My grandfather taught me to read water the way some folks read scripture, with that same quiet certainty that a thing moving is a thing alive, and a thing alive is a thing that can carry you if you let it. He'd point with his stick and say the creek'll tell on the mountain long before the mountain tells on itself. Watch the riffles for wind you can't feel. Watch the foam circles for the long pull of a sinkhole. Listen for the pitch dropping before a cold snap. So I kept to the water when the ridge trails got icy, following its silver thread up past Tallow Bend, where the hemlocks stand like a congregation that forgot how to sing. The day had the color of old tin, the air thin enough that dead leaves made more sound than they weighed. I was 3 bends above the rusted cattle gate when the music of the creek, small, constant, the kind that hides in your head so you don't notice it till it's gone, just stopped. It didn't taper or gurgle out. One step it was there, the next step it was like I'd walked into a room after someone unplugged the refrigerator and the new silence had a shape. I stood with my boot on a slick stone and waited for the world to remember itself. The stillness wasn't like night, when sound tucks itself into the folds of dark. It was brittle, the kind where a breath seems like it might break something. I told myself ice had choked the run somewhere upstream, though the air didn't bite like ice. Then the smell shifted, less mineral, less green. I caught iron, wet rock, and the dry dust of gravel sifted by a hand. My eyes adjusted to the creek bed without its glitter, and there he was, crouched in the center of it, as natural as a fallen branch isn't natural. Both hands digging and pouring, like a child checking pockets that won't give back what they took. At first I thought a hunter had slipped and cracked his head, sat up dazed, but his skin had the color of candle fat, stretched thin where it should fold, like sun hadn't reached him in years. He wore clothes that used to be clothes, denim rubbed to thread on the knees, a shirt so washed of itself that it matched the stones. I said, "Hey," soft and steady, because men who winter in the woods can be skittish as deer, and you don't spook what you want to help. My voice died in the space between us, swallowed by that held breath the creek wasn't taking. He kept sifting, fingers combing pebbles with a care that made my scalp prickle. He brought handfuls to his face and smelled them, not like you smell a rose, but like you check for gas at a stove. Practical, scared of the wrong outcome. I took a step down the bank. The leaves didn't crackle. My boots slid with no sound at all. He stopped, his head lifted slow, as if his neck remembered the motion from a long time ago. When our eyes met, the part of me that keeps track of the weather and the best switchback and how to find my way in fog just misfiled. Something in his gaze was familiar without being known, like catching your reflection crooked in a dark window. He opened his mouth. It made a shape of a word I nearly recognized, but nothing came out. Not even a rasp. Just a slow, deliberate shake of the head that said, "Don't," said "no," said "leave the way you came" without the mercy of sound to cushion it. I told him I had water and a bar in my pack. I told him I could go get help. The words felt wrong, too heavy for the air that had no room to carry them. He lifted one hand, palm out, and there were faint half-moons of dirt under nails grown too long, the beds pale as fish bellies. The creek twitched at the edge of hearing, a ghost of itself shivering down the stones. Then it was there again, all at once, rushing like a lung finally letting go, like a crowd's whisper rising when a door opens. He flinched and hunched and pressed his hands into the wet as if to hold it still. I stumbled backward, my heel catching a root, and the sound of the water seemed to push me up the bank, louder than its small body should be, chattering over rock in a voice I knew since childhood that suddenly had too much to say. I turned before he could shake his head again because I understood the kindness in it and couldn't stand to take any more. The trail, which is nothing but a suggestion for most of the year, felt clear as a printed map. I walked fast enough to heat my chest, slow enough that panic didn't stiffen my knees. Every bend gave the illusion of distance, and with each bend the creek's voice settled into a normal I no longer trusted. When Tallow Bend leveled into pasture and my cell found the thin breath of a tower, I called the sheriff out of guilt more than hope, said there was a man up by the dry run who might be hurt, left out the part where the creek had stopped like a clock wound down. They said they'd send someone if the bridge wasn't iced. By the time I reached my truck, the light had turned bruised and the temperature dropped enough that the metal made my palms sting. I sat with the heater wheezing and watched the pasture darken, remembering my grandfather's hands, how scarred they were from a lifetime of convincing stubborn things to move. He used to tell a story about Tallow Bend, a family that went under in the fever year, and a boy who wandered off during the burying because he couldn't bear the sound of the creek rattling pebbles like bone in a plate. Some folks, Grandpa said, can't tolerate a world that keeps going. I drove home slow. Every culvert sang, and every song felt like a lie told kindly. The deputy called after 8 to say he and a volunteer had hiked in as far as the gate before darkness made fools of them. They found nothing, he said. No man, No prints more than the usual, and the creek was running fine, maybe a little high. He laughed when he said hi, like the mountain had gotten into him too. I said, "Thank you the way you thank a doctor who tells you the tests were negative when you still feel a lump." That night, the house took on that cabin closeness it gets in cold weather. The kind where you can hear mice decide against a venture behind the cabinets. I kept thinking about his hands, how they searched the stones with such patience, like he expected a particular shape to be there if he only asked the question right. Around midnight, a brief power blink rolled the house back to quiet. In that breath of blackout, the refrigerator died, and I heard it. The pause again, the creakless hush, but inside my walls. I stood in the doorway and felt the same brittle air on my teeth, tasted iron. The power came back, and the furnace exhaled, and the sensation drained like blood leaving a face. I slept in starts, waking to the sound of running water that wasn't in the pipes, but in my head, and sometimes to a silence so clean it made my ears ring. For a week, I avoided that side of the ridge. When I finally drove past the trailhead, I didn't stop. I knew if I went back, I wouldn't call out this time. I'd step down into the bed and join the search without knowing what we were looking for. Now, when the creek near my place swells with thaw, I watch the foam circles and think of hands sifting gravel for answers the land doesn't give up. My grandfather said water keeps the mountain honest. Maybe. Or maybe it just moves around what we can't bear to hear, and when it finally goes quiet, all that's left in the pause is us and what we've lost, looking up with an open mouth that makes no sound. Story 4. The Hollow, where whistling carries. The hollow looked harmless in daylight, a crease between two ridges where the wind went to rest, and the creek thread narrowed to a bright stitch through laurel and rock. I picked it for the same reason you pick a seat facing the door. I wanted to see what came at me, and the tilt of the slopes made a natural amphitheater that felt like a defensible bowl. By dusk, I had my little tent pinned against a clump of rhododendron, a fire the size of a shoebox, and the kind of quiet you only notice once your hands are done working. I cooked from a can and ate slow, letting the long day run out of my bones. I could hear the lightest things, a gnat tapping my ear, the soft rush of the creek shouldering a stone, a single leaf turning in place because another leaf told it to. I've slept in worse spots. I've slept in places where trees lean over you like they have a secret. This hollow was just a place, I told myself. Then, somewhere past full dark, a whistle floated in. 3 notes, each held a beat longer than it needed to be. Not musical, not a tune I knew from church or radio, just breath shaped and pushed, the way you tell a dog to come without wanting the neighbors to hear. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far enough either, which is to say, the hills did that thing hills do, catching sound in their elbows and passing it around until direction came unstitched. I sat up. The fire had gone to coals, and the lantern I'd hung from a sapling through a small circle that looked ridiculous against so much dark. The whistle came again, same 3 notes, patient as counting. I said hello, because you say something before you decide you should have said nothing. My voice went out and didn't come back. I told myself it was another camper on the ridge or a father calling a kid late off a trail. It kept repeating, always the same, yet somehow louder without coming from any particular place, as if the hollow had learned it and was rehearsing. I put on my boots. Not to go anywhere, just because laces make your hands busy, and busy hands keep your chest from tightening. The air cooled in that sudden way mountains have, a drop you can feel first on your teeth. The whistle cut, and the silence behind it felt like someone had put a lid on the world. I could hear my own pulse under my tongue. Far off, a twig cracked the way twigs crack in stories about twigs. I held the lantern higher, and that's when I saw him. At the rim of light, where leaves silvered and then quit, a man stood barefoot, toes sunk into the duff, head tilted like a question. His pants were dark and stiff with old mud to the knee, shirt buttoned wrong so the placket ran a crooked line up his chest, hair lying flat except where the crown stuck from some long habit of a hat. He wasn't looking at me, he was listening, chin up just a notch, neck long. Some part of me wanted to say his name as if I had one ready. The other part wanted to snuff the lantern so there'd be nothing for him to measure. He didn't move forward, didn't reach for me or even startle at the sight of another person. He just turned in place with the carefulness of someone who hasn't had his shoes on in a while, and he walked back into the dark with that same 3-note whistle riding under his breath. Quieter now, but close enough that I could feel the pattern of it more than hear it. I stood there longer than makes sense, the lantern ticking, the coals sighing. If he'd asked for food or water, I would have handed him both. If he'd asked for anything that had words in it, I could have worked with that. The whistling started again, farther up the hollow, then answered behind me, the same 3 notes but sloped different, like the hill on the left had less patience than the hill on the right. I spun, and the light tripped over brush and caught nothing. You learn out here that your body wants a direction almost as badly as it wants water, and when it can't find one, it drinks fear as a substitute. I told myself it was echo, just echo, but echoes don't start up after a pause like they made the decision to continue without you. I threw another stick on the fire because ritual matters, because flame pushes back even if only a hand's length. The whistling stopped again, cleanly, like a lesson ended. I tried to remember if I'd heard that pattern somewhere. Fox hunter's call, maybe, or the old killdeer trick, but memory turned slippery. I set the lantern back on the ground and crawled into the tent without zipping the door. I lay on top of my bag with the knife I used to split kindling set on my chest like an apology. I didn't sleep so much as hold my breaths in different sizes until they formed a row. Somewhere between one row and the next, I heard it, not the whistle, but breath being pulled through teeth, the way a person listens to themselves when they're trying to be quieter than their own lungs. It was close enough that the tent fabric tight to my ear caught the sound and handed it to me. I turned my head and saw the faintest shape of a heel outside. Then nothing. Then a palm's weight settled gently against the nylon, testing it, not pressing. I expected the hand to slide, but it didn't. It lifted, and then the whistle came from right above me, those 3 deliberate notes more air than tone, as if the man wanted the sound to soak through the skin of the tent and ring in my bones. I said, "I hear you," because I did. The notes ceased. A long minute spilled its contents. Then his footsteps moved away, not crashing, not sneaking, just the soft lift and set of bare feet that know every route. He didn't go up either ridge. He kept to the slot of the hollow, and I heard the creek pick up his pace and carry it until it wasn't pace anymore, only water being water. I packed before dawn. I know that reads like cowardice. Maybe it is. I left a bag of jerky and a bottle where the lantern had been, both wrapped in a plastic sack against the damp, the way you leave offerings when you're not sure who you're bargaining with. On the climb out, the hollow breathed like it had lungs again. Chickadees restarted their arithmetic. My legs remembered their work. At the ridge crest, I looked back and saw nothing but a seam of fog lying low like a blanket tucked by someone with careful hands. In town, I asked at the store if anybody was missing, and the woman at the counter said everybody's missing somebody, which wasn't what I meant. Later, an old man nursing coffee asked me where I'd pitched, and when I told him, he said that place will carry a tune for you, whether you want it carried or not. He said, "Don't answer it if it ain't yours." I haven't camped there again. Some nights though, when the wind comes long down the chimney and makes the flue sing. I hear 3 notes my house shouldn't know. They don't frighten me the way they did. They do something worse. They make me tilt my head and listen, and in the moment before the sound is only wind again, I wonder if I'm learning it. If one evening I'll step out barefoot into my own yard and whistle back, soft enough that nobody but the hills will understand what I'm saying. Story 5. The Man in the Gas Station. Lot. The rain had been coming sideways for an hour by the time I saw the lights of the gas station. 2 pale tubes buzzing over a sagging awning. The kind of place that looked like it belonged to another decade and had just forgotten to shut down. I was miles into the highlands, roads slick as slate, tires cutting through shallow rivers that slid across the asphalt. The gauge needle was kissing empty, and I figured if the pumps were working, I'd take my luck there rather than risk stalling out in the dark. The lot was empty except for a single pickup parked nose first against the far fence, rain pooling in its bed. The pump's card reader was dark. I tried lifting the handle but nothing, just a metallic cough, like the thing hadn't been used in months. I ran inside, bell over the door giving a sad little jingle, but the counter was empty. No sound, no backroom chatter, just the hum of a cooler and the sharp smell of stale coffee. I called out, waited, then called again. Nothing. When I stepped back outside, I froze halfway through the door. There was a man standing dead center in the lot, perfectly still. The rain was hitting him hard enough to run in sheets down his face, but he didn't blink, didn't wipe at his eyes. His clothes were filthy, soaked through, torn in these strange straight lines, as if a blade had cut them in measured strokes. I asked if he was okay. My voice sounded too loud in the space between the storm and the lights. He didn't answer. I took a step toward my car, and his head turned slightly, slow enough that I could hear the wet creak of his collar. That was all. No words, no change in stance. Just watching. I got in, locked the doors, started the engine. The wipers dragged rain aside, and for a second I lost him in the blur. Then he was there again, in the glass, same spot, only his head was straight now, shoulders square to me. I put it in gear and rolled forward. He didn't move. By the time I hit the edge of the lot, my pulse was in my throat. I pressed harder on the gas. The road curved away into blackness, the station's glow shrinking behind me. I glanced in the mirror. He was walking after me, not running, not even looking hurried, just walking, each step steady and deliberate. I kept accelerating, watching the speed climb, 40, 50, 60. My headlights caught the road signs in quick, white flashes. When I checked again, he was still there, still walking, the distance between us not changing the way it should. Rain blurred him at the edges, but I could see enough. The rhythm of his steps, the way his arms hung unnaturally still, swinging just enough to keep time with whatever he was following. I don't remember much of the next few miles except the sound of the storm and the hiss of the tires. When I finally turned off onto the main highway, I looked one last time. The lot was gone. The road behind me, a twisting ribbon of dark. He wasn't there. I tell myself I left him back in the rain, standing in the light, watching the road. But some nights when I'm driving in weather thick enough to make the world small, I catch myself checking the mirror too often, expecting to see him just at the edge of the glass. Walking, always walking, closing a distance that never really closes. I straightened up slowly, my pulse still pounding in my ears. The quiet at the trailhead didn't feel like safety. It felt like the kind of stillness that waits to see what you'll do next. I kept scanning the mouth of the logging road, expecting at any second for those lights to drift back into view, slow again, like they'd never been chasing me at all. The pines stood tight and black, their tips lost against the night sky. Even without the lights, I could feel where they had been, like heat lingering after a fire dies down. I told myself I'd imagined the height, the sway, that maybe they were hunters with gear slung over their shoulders, but the thought didn't settle right. The rhythm had been too even, the way the lights had paused when I paused. That smell of sap still clung to my clothes, sharp and sweet, and I caught myself brushing at my sleeves as if it was something physical I could knock loose. I stayed there for a long minute before heading to the lot where my car was parked, every step feeling like I was walking away from something that could just as easily be walking behind me. When I unlocked the door, the dome light seemed too bright in the emptiness, throwing my shadow out across the gravel. The drive back down the mountain was slow, curves swallowing the headlights before I could see far ahead. A few times I caught myself checking the mirror, not for headlights but for some faint glow bobbing along the road behind me. I never saw it. Still, when I got home and pulled into the drive, the smell of pine sap followed me out of the car, as fresh and sharp as if the trees had been cut only seconds before. Story 6. The handprint on my tent. The second night had the kind of wind that works on you. It wasn't a steady push. It came in bursts, snapping branches up the slope, making the ridgeline sound like it was groaning under its own weight. I'd pitched the tent low in a hollow, hoping the trees would break most of it, but the gusts still worked their way through, shivering the nylon. The air was sharp enough that my breath fogged inside the tent, and I tucked deeper into my sleeping bag, pulling the zipper all the way up until only my nose was out. Sometime past midnight, the wind dropped, just stopped, like a door had shut on it. That was when I heard it. Soft steps in the leaves, not the quick nervous patter of a raccoon, not the erratic scuffle of a fox. These were slow, measured, like someone walking a circle, heel then toe, never hurrying. They moved around the tent once, twice, the sound muffled but close enough that the frost-damp leaves had their own rhythm under the weight. I held my breath, the kind of stillness where even your heartbeat feels too loud. The steps stopped at the head of the tent. A shadow fell across the thin fabric, and then I felt it, 5 fingers pressing down, the tips long enough to stretch almost from my temple to my chin. The weight was gentle, but it was deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. The nylon sagged under it, creasing over my forehead. It stayed like that for what I counted as 10 slow seconds. Then the hand began to slide, dragging across the slope of the tent wall toward the ground. The sound of it, a faint rasp as skin or cloth or something dry met the nylon, made the hair on my arms rise inside the sleeping bag. The fingers slipped out of reach, and the steps moved away without breaking into a run, fading toward the trees. I lay there until the grey of morning started seeping into the fabric. My breath had left a patch of damp that felt cold as metal when I unzipped the bag. Outside, the air bit hard at my nose, and frost glazed every leaf, every blade of grass, the ground crunching under my boots. I walked a slow circle around the tent, scanning for prints, boot, barefoot, anything. There was nothing. Not even where I'd heard the steps stop beside me. I packed fast, my fingers clumsy in the cold, feeling watched even as the woods stayed empty. On the hike out, the wind picked up again, but it carried no branches this time, only a faint hiss through the trees. I never saw another soul on the trail. Still, when I think back to that night, it isn't the steps or even the hand that comes to mind first. It's how certain I was that whoever it was didn't want to get in. They wanted me to know they could have. I didn't go back into the backcountry for a while after that. Even short day hikes felt different, like the woods were carrying a private conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. Weeks later, when I finally did head out again, I stayed on well-marked trails, kept to open spaces where I could see 100 yards in every direction. But sometimes, without warning, the smell of fresh pine sap would drift in on still air, so faint I almost believed I'd imagined it. One afternoon in early spring, I stopped into the small general store near the base of the ridge to grab coffee. The woman behind the counter, old enough to have seen 3 generations grow up in those hills, Asked where I'd been hiking lately. I told her I'd been keeping closer to town after a strange night in the cutover past Ashfern. She didn't smile or ask what happened. She just went quiet, eyes flicking down to the counter like she was deciding whether to say something. Finally, she told me, "You keep out of that logging road after dark. Things follow on it that don't need roads anymore." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but she'd already rung me up and turned to the next customer. I drove home with that sentence riding in my head, heavier than I wanted it to be. That night, I dreamed I was back on the road, the smell of resin clinging to the air so thick I could taste it. In the dream, I never turned to see the lights. I just felt them behind me, keeping pace, never gaining, never falling away. When I woke, the taste of pine was still in my mouth, and my shirt smelled faintly of it, though I hadn't been near the woods in days. Story 7. The Vanishing Campfire Across the Lake. It was late October, the kind of cold that creeps into your sleeves before the sun even thinks about dropping. I'd hiked up to the lake because it sat far enough off the trail that you could count on being alone, ringed by spruce and laurel so thick you could hear your own breathing more than the wind. The water was dark, even in daylight, holding the sky like it didn't trust it. I set my tent back from the shore, cooked fish over my little stove, and watched mist start to skate across the surface as night came in. The moon was new, and when the sun went, the dark came quickly, thick enough that my lantern felt like a candle in a cave. I'd just settled in with a book when a flicker caught my eye through the trees. Across the lake, maybe 100 yards away, a campfire had bloomed out of nothing, sudden, steady, throwing orange into the water. At first, I was glad to see it. Another camper meant someone else had made it up here, maybe with a story or a spare beer. I watched as shapes moved around it, blurred and loose with the distance, their outlines bending in the heat shimmer. There was no sound but the occasional pop of my own fire. Whatever they were saying, the lake kept it. One by one, the figures stepped away from the fire and into the tree line. They didn't take gear, didn't carry light, didn't speak. Just turned and went into the dark like they'd been called. Soon there was only the fire, licking at the air. I told myself they'd gone for wood. And sure enough, after a few minutes, the flames brightened, snapping like someone had just thrown on fresh logs. But the space around it stayed empty. No one returned. I watched longer than I should have, waiting for a shape to pass between me and the glow, for the easy evidence of people still tending it. Nothing moved. Then, as if the night had decided it was done with the whole thing, the fire went out. No sputter, no fade, just gone. Across the water, the bank was swallowed by black. I sat there for a while, telling myself it was nothing, that maybe the angle had tricked me and the fire was hidden by a shift in the wind. But the air was still, and the water was flat as a plate. I didn't sleep much. Every so often, I'd glance through the tent flap, half expecting that glow to return, or worse, to find it on my side of the lake. In the morning, I paddled over just to prove to myself that it had been ordinary. The far bank was cold, shaded by tall spruce. No fire ring, no ash, not even a scuffed patch of earth where boots might have stood. Just wet needles, moss, and the quiet drip of water from the trees. I left early, but the whole hike out, I kept thinking about those figures stepping into the woods without a sound, and how the fire had burned brighter after they were gone. Now, when I think of that lake, I don't remember the fish or the cold. I remember watching a fire vanish into nothing and wondering what it had been warming in the first place. Story 8. The Boy Under the Bridge. The bridge had been closed so long, the signs warning about it were more weathered than the beams themselves. Folks said the county meant to tear it down, but nothing ever came of it. I'd taken the low trail that morning, following Ashfern Creek where it twisted through a cut of shale and moss, water cold enough to numb your feet if you waded in too long. The air smelled of wet stone, and the only sound was the creek folding over itself in the deeper spots. When I came around the bend and saw the underside of the bridge, I almost missed the movement. Something shifted in the shadowed tangle of support beams. Small, quick. I slowed, thinking it might be an animal, but then I saw him. A boy, maybe 10, crouched low like he'd been hiding. His hair was plastered to his head with mud, darkened until it looked almost black. His skin was pale under the streaks of dirt, lips moving. I stepped into the water, the cold biting my ankles, and tried to catch what he was saying. It wasn't loud enough to be words, just a whisper tangled in the creek's murmur. When I asked if he was all right, his head snapped toward me in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. His eyes were too wide, fixed on me like he couldn't decide whether I was a threat or a chance. I took another step, water pushing against my calves, and in that blink, he was gone. Not like he'd run, more like he'd folded back into the shadows beneath the beams. I sloshed forward, heart kicking harder now, and pulled myself up onto the bank beside the bridge. The smell under there was sharp, mud, old wood, something faintly metallic. But there was no boy, just a small pile of wet clothes, neatly folded, the fabric so soaked it sagged in the middle. A trail of bare footprints led away from the pile, each one pressed deep into the damp earth, toes splayed like they'd been walking barefoot a long time. They went straight into the trees, vanishing where the undergrowth thickened. I called out once more, voice carrying thin through the quiet, but nothing moved out there. No reply, not even a bird shifting in the branches. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at those prints until they stopped, the edges already softening under the weight of the air. On the way back down the trail, I kept expecting to hear the whisper again somewhere behind me, just quiet enough to make me wonder if I'd imagined it in the first place. Story 9, The Lights in the Logging Road. The cutover section had that raw, exposed feel you get where the forest's been stripped bare, stumps like broken teeth, piles of limbs going grey in the weather, and the smell of resin still sharp enough to sting the back of your throat. I'd been in deeper than I meant to be, following a deer trail that spat me out onto the old logging road just as the lights started dropping fast. The plan was simple. Take the road back toward the trailhead. Cover ground quick before dark set in. The sky went from pale gold to a flat grey, and the road narrowed with every turn, the young pines leaning in from the sides. That's when I saw them. 2 lights bobbing ahead, steady but swaying side to side. They weren't the quick jitter of flashlights. These moved slow, deliberate, like lanterns swinging from a long carry. They were too high up for a person's hand, maybe 10 feet off the ground, drifting in rhythm with each other. I stopped. They stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than the trees. My boots felt loud in the damp dirt when I shifted my weight. I called out, half expecting an echo, half hoping someone would answer and make it normal. Nothing. I took 1 step backward. The lights started forward again, faster now, the sway tighter, more urgent. The road seemed to narrow in front of me, our shadows folding in, and the air turned sharp with the smell of fresh-cut pine, like something had just been split open. I turned and walked quick at first, not wanting to look like I was running. The sound of my own steps was loud enough that I couldn't tell if anything else was moving behind me. Curiosity almost made me glance back, but something in me said, "No, keep your eyes ahead, keep your pace." The smell of sap grew stronger, almost sticky in my throat, and the pines on either side pressed closer, their branches whispering against each other in a wind I couldn't feel. When I finally broke into a run, it wasn't a choice. It was my body deciding for me. The road pitched slightly downhill, and I let it carry me, lungs burning, the sound of my breath too fast to hide. I could feel the open space of the trailhead coming before I saw it, a widening of the dark ahead. I didn't look back until I was on the gravel, bent over with my hands on my knees, gulping air. The road behind me was empty, just a dark cut through the pines. No lights, no movement. Still, the smell of sap lingered, faint but clinging, as if something had followed me as far as it could before letting go. For the next few days, I kept catching myself glancing toward the tree line behind my place, especially after sundown. It's just second growth forest back there, nothing deep, nothing wild, but in the dim, it presses close. One evening, I stepped out to bring in firewood and caught a whiff of that same sharp sap, fresh and raw, like a wound still bleeding. I stood there a long time, listening. No wind, no creak of branches, just that smell. It's strange how a scent can carry weight, how it can make you remember the way your chest felt tightening on that road, the way the shadows seemed to lean in. I told myself it had to be the neighbor splitting wood, the smell drifting on still air. But when I went back inside, I checked through the windows and his yard was dark. I've thought about going back, walking that road in daylight to see if it looks smaller, more ordinary, to prove it was nothing. But I know that if I did, I'd find myself counting the seconds until the sun dipped and the air cooled, wondering if the lights would wait until I was far enough in that there'd be nowhere to run.